it was suggested to me by somebody much wiser than myself that if I'm going to put defrag in the talk of my title, I should define it for the younger folks in the audience. So back in the day, before solid-state drives were a thing, the files on the disk used to become more and more fragmented over time. So the sectors that made up the files were scattered all over the disk, and the OS had to race around the disk to get everything it needed in order to access the file. And it took a long time. So we used to have to defrag our hard drives to make accessing files on the disk faster. And when we look at the value stream, and when I talk about value stream, I mean all the activities we have to do in order to provide business value. When people have to chase around the value stream in order to get the work that they need done, it takes a lot of time. So today I'm going to share with you some secrets on how to speed up a fragmented value stream, one where handoffs occur between the different areas across the value stream. They're just not as clean as they should be. Recently, I worked with a sales ops team. These are the group of people who do NDAs and statement of works and terms and conditions for contracts so salespeople can close deals. And I'm helping them make their work visible and optimize their workflow because that's what I do. It's the work I love the most. And I find out that, like IT, they too have a vast amount of unplanned work, conflicting priorities, and too much work in progress. And like IT, their customers are grumbling about the same things that IT customers are grumbling about, and that is that things take too long, the progress of the work is invisible, and the handoffs are challenging. Right? Things get lost. So in the case of sales ops, handoffs occur via email. Like, how many of you still get requests via email to do work? Right? And so then what do you have to do with that? Like sales ops, they have to copy that information out of the email into their work tool. They're using Jira. But the salespeople are using Salesforce, so they can't see what's in Jira. And emails end up going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and it's not as clean as it could be. Communication and details get lost in the email. And so this impacts communication and collaboration, and it delays delivery. And you may be asking, why is she talking about sales ops? I thought this was a DevOps conference. But the thing is, things take too long is a universal problem. Salespeople understand that. Business people understand it because they're dealing with it themselves. Largely because the work that we're doing is hard. It's really hard what you're doing in enterprise IT. You got thousands of engineers building hundreds of different features across dozens of different work item types. You got mergers and acquisitions, and the work is complex. So as a human, we tend to break down that complexity into smaller pieces so it's manageable. And this is what introduces specialization. The hardest thing we do is communicate across teams. So in order to solve this problem, we need to find and fix the fragmented work, the broken handoffs, the communication debt that exists, that occurs between the different experts all through the value stream. And this is how we start defragging. And by defragging, we can find and fix flow problems. As many of you already know, flow problem, and flow is the first way of DevOps, right? If you get the DevOps handbook, you're going to see flow as the underpinning principle of the first practice. And flow, as a review for most of you, is all about making work visible because it's hard to manage invisible work, and limiting work in progress so we don't get all these queues that get built up that Damon Edwards mentioned this morning, and to reduce batch size so we can get feedback faster. And we have these flow practices in place. These are the things that help us pull value through the value stream quicker, predictably, and smoother. Right? So it's like a ballet with synchronized movements where things flow smoothly. I'm going to talk about 3 points. The first one is that work is getting more and more complex, and it's driving necessary specialization. This is my granddaughter, Melly. At 9 years old, she was seeing 4 different therapists. She's seen a speech therapist because she can't pronounce G or S. She's seen a physical therapist because her balance is a bit off and she really can't ride a bicycle. She's seen an occupational therapist because she's got a bit of tremor in her hand and she doesn't have a good pencil grip, so her handwriting is not too good. And they were all recommended to her by her primary care physician. So there's 100 years ago, you had 2 medical practitioners, the nurse and the doctor, and now you have 120 medical specialists and subspecialties. The primary care physician, I think of as just somebody that you go to get triaged. So the physician had recommended these therapists, but none of them were working for Melly for a long time. They just didn't help her. And then a year ago, we stumbled across this TED Talk from a doctor in New York who was doing this incredible work with children who had cerebral palsy. And after lots of research, we recognized that maybe this combination of symptoms that Melly had, they just mimicked ever so slightly a rare form of CP. Well, the TED Talk doctor has a clinic in New York. We live in Seattle, but in February, Melly goes off to New York. And within 2 days, after correcting her form, it was all about form, with this compression arm sleeve and this hand brace, it aligned her thumb. And now she's able to maintain this beautiful pencil grip and write. And a similar thing happened with her speech on day 4. I don't have time to get into it, but it was truly remarkable. After 7 years of trying to figure out what the heck is going on, this expert specialist in New York, the clinic, it wasn't just one person, but this clinic helps us figure it out in 4 days. So we need specialists to deal with complexity. There's this thing called essential complexity, and I think the medical analogy helps us to see how hard the problem is, right, in IT, because in IT we've got, you've acquired 3 different companies, and everybody has their own separate tools and their different ways of working, and there's this increased complexity from all the dependencies and integration issues across all those different teams. So it's this essential complexity in the way that I like to think of it, the way that I can understand it for myself is when I think about how civilization changed when we went from bartering for things to using money to pay for things. Once currency got introduced, now you need governance, and you need banks, or you need politics. You need a way to control things, right? And so with scale comes complexity. We see similar things with the PCI audit, right? The more servers we have, the more firewalls we have, the more employees who handle payment data, the more complexity we have, and then the costs go up with every transaction processed. And on top of that, there's lots of people hanging out in a lot of long meetings all day long. Scott Prue from CSG yesterday mentioned that his teams are spending 20,000 hours a year on PCI, so it's very expensive. But how does this happen? Well, everybody gets invited to the meeting because the information that's needed is in all these specialist heads, right? The PM, the project manager, doesn't understand, not always, all the technical details, and the storage engineer can't see the vulnerabilities in the networking devices. And so I was mentioning this to somebody, and they said, but we have full-stack engineers, and they know everything. And I think that if they did, then we wouldn't have to have these great big meetings with everybody in the room eating pizza all weekend long. They probably don't want to be in those meetings. And here's a meeting they certainly don't want to be in. This is the Verizon report on the security data breaches. It's huge. It's growing, especially in healthcare. Healthcare has more data breaches than anybody else. Apparently, cyber attacks in healthcare is much more viable than getting somebody's credit card information. And there's HIPAA data breaches that are on the rise. And I just read this Forbes article that said in 2017, we're going to have a global shortage of 2 million cybersecurity professionals by 2019. So clearly, we need security experts. But not everybody wants to do security. So this is from the DevSecOps community survey results, and it's showing that 48% of developers are saying they don't have enough time to do development or to do security. Just like the primary care physician doesn't have time to know everything there is to know about the human body, how do developers do all they do now and continue to learn and retrain? It's hard enough just to keep up, just to stay relevant with all the retraining that has to happen. And not everybody wants to do security. From this survey, apparently 20% are saying it's not their job. So as Mick Kirsten says in his awesome new book, that the more we scale, the more we need specialized people. Next up, specialization causes expensive disconnects. So if you have a heart issue and you go see your primary care physician, they don't have enough data, so they send you to the lab to get some data, right? You probably got to drive there a few days later. You get your results. You come back to your primary physician. They say this doesn't look good. You should go see the cardiologist. You go to the cardiologist, and they say this doesn't look good, but yet they have to send you to more specialists. So you got to go to the dietitian who says you got to stop eating so much bacon, and then you go to the pharmacy because you need some blood thinners or whatever. And you should, by the way, you need to go to the physical therapist because you need to start exercising more. And if you don't pay attention, you end up in the hospital with a coronary. And everywhere you go, you have to fill out the same identical information across all these different systems because the systems aren't talking to each other. And there's a cost to that. The hand-ups have a cost. So my mom was in the hospital getting this heart stress test. And she stays overnight, and the doctor's orders were no caffeine 24 hours before the test. Well, the next morning, the nurse gives my mom coffee, probably because she's impossible without her double caramel, mocha, latte, whatever. And so they can't do the test that day. So she spends another night, which is not the cheapest place to spend the night. And so the next morning, she manages to get by remarkably without coffee. But then, so they wheel her into the nuclear tech part of the hospital, and the pharmacy tech hands the nuclear tech the wrong tracker. She's supposed to get a heart tracker, but she gets injected with a bone tracker. So again, she can't do her test that she went in there for. And because bad things happen in threes, I say, Mom, we got to get out of here. Pack your bags. Medical errors cause more deaths. They're the third leading cause of death in the US. So according to this Johns Hopkins report, we've got over 250,000 deaths per year due to medical errors. And we see a similar thing in IT sometimes. This was the situation when I worked at large telecom back during the original rollout of the iPhone. And our business people were marketing people. They're doing an e-com site. And their requests end up in this system called Prism, and that's where they would do the funding. They're still doing 18-month-long funding cycles. And then business analysts would write up requirements in Word documents, and then those would get reviewed at meetings. We had all these meetings with the bridge call with the phone in the middle of the table. And Deb was working in Java and Oracle, and QA was working in Quality Center. And at the end of the week, we all had to fill out our timesheets in Primavera, and we never quite understood why we needed to do that. And PMO was tracking work on Gantt charts, and then we had these, what I call red, yellow, green reports, where usually most things are green. And so this was a while ago, but I called my friend last week. I said, how's it going? And she said, things have improved a little bit. We've got Rally, and we're doing our requirements in Rally now, and we've done some Agile, and we've gotten this new framework, but some people are still doing things the old way, and we're still considered a cost center. So if we look at the cost from disconnected work in IT, If a VP calls you in to an office and chews you out because you reported red on a red, yellow, green report, like you told the truth, then how long are you going to hang out there? Probably not. People are going to leave. Like, I left. And then customers are unhappy because things take too long. And the data's inaccurate from the timesheets because people don't understand why they need to do it. And everybody knew the numbers were wrong. So the estimates are bad. And if we look at costs, then we have to think, is this a cost center or a profit center? And if we're still working with a cost center mentality and there's no investment in IT for the future, all the more reason for people to want to bail. Key point 3, if you don't address problems related to complexity and specialization, then somebody will exploit it. And it's already happening in healthcare big time. So we've got Jamie Dimon and Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett are all collaborating. They've created a new company on healthcare, and their goal is to cut healthcare costs. And as soon as they made that announcement in January, many other healthcare companies' stocks plummeted. What they're trying to do is set up a one-stop shop, and we see startups looking at this too, where you don't have to race around the value stream to get everything you need, because all the experts and the specialists and the blood lab work are in one place, right? It makes it easy for all that paperwork to flow through. And news is saying this is going to disrupt supply chains across all industries. When it comes to technology disruption, just like 100 years ago, we had the nurse and the doctor. Now, we've got a whole ton of tools. When I was doing builds on IBM mainframes back in the 80s, we had assembly language, JCL, and C++. Right? That was about it. Now we have over 120 different DevOps tools on this awesome Zebia Labs periodic table chart. And the result of that, though, is because people are using their own tool, because in DevOps we're saying that, right? Teams should be able to use their tool of choice. We've got lots of different tools that don't talk to each other, and they're disconnected across the value stream. So in the intersection of this, this is where I spent the bulk of my career. Right? If I was always a boundary between different functions, I would, doing configuration management and builds, I was in between dev and test, and engineering and ops, and product and dev. And oftentimes, these handoffs, the communication handoffs, were invisible. And so I'd always have to ask people, hey, will you please create a ticket for that? Or make it visible so we can see it. Otherwise, you get something like this, where everybody's working in their different tool, which is OK, but now you're dependent on email or spreadsheets or status meetings in order to communicate that information. And I put a quote by Scott here about this tool confusion fight that occurs because people are arguing about, no, you should use our tool. And on the other side, no, you should use our tool. The reality is it's complex. We have a lot of different tools. If you consolidate your tools, it might reduce some complexity, but then you're telling people that you can't use the best tool for them to get their job done. So it's a trade-off. It's a challenge for sure. But I'd have to say that if I had a brain aneurysm and ended up in a hospital, I want the brain surgeon to use the brain surgery tools, not the orthopedic surgery tools. So here's an example of how a Fortune 100 company managed to make connections visible. Their problem, basically, like just about everybody else, things take too long. And they were doing some of the goodness to improve their flow. They were making their work visible, and they were limiting some of their work in progress and trying to reduce their batch size. And so there was some optimization in dev and build and test. But no one was paying attention to how long things took up front. Right, in the orange there, up in the orange. And they often wondered, how does the work request that comes into the business end up in our dev backlog to begin with, right? So they started measuring lead time. They discovered that it was the funding and the planning part of it that was taking about 50% of their entire time across the value stream. And emphasized the point that it doesn't matter how optimized one part of the system is if there's a bottleneck upstream or downstream. And so the part that they needed to defrag was this upfront in orange here, this budgeting and planning part. And it was hard for them to flow fast because they had a 12-month funding cycle. But they did a number of things. They did make their connections visible. They started to sync up those connections between the other work items with development. So then they have flow metrics. They have more flow metrics across their value stream. I actually wrote a story about this, which tells a larger picture. It's usually never just one thing. The other thing for them that they had to do was clearly define priorities for all these specialized experts across the value stream. And for them, that was primarily people who were writing use cases. So what areas in your value stream have expensive handoffs? One area is to look at what I call revenue generation. These are the requests you get from the business, the demand that the business gives you to do like new features in your product. And this is where it can get a little bit tricky, because if effort is measured differently, for example, if business is looking at timesheets to see effort and development is looking at velocity to see effort, then the perspectives are different and things aren't quite aligned as well as they could be. So making these connections visible for how work is handed off and communicated for revenue generating work can be useful, right? And I'm calling them work items, the items in yellow, that whatever you call them, epics or stories or tasks, you probably have 25 or 30 different names for those work item types. But if it turns out that you're communicating that through email, then put that on your chart. I mean, there's a reason why large companies want to use their special tools, right? It's complex. It's not two guys in a garage. If you just got a small company, you're fine, right, with just one tool. But if you've got 10,000 or 8,000 people in engineering, you've likely got a bunch of different tools. And if they're not talking to each other, it's a problem. The second area to look at is on the other end. How is work coming in from production? Contrary to what many people think, production comes first, right? Production's down, everybody's impacted. You can't say no to a production problem. And so where does work originate inside an issue that happens in production? How do failures need to be communicated? Right? If you have to go chasing all around the value stream to get that information communicated to, say, if an incident or a failure needs to be escalated to developers, how do they get that information? Right? So the idea here is to make that visible. Otherwise you get a fragmented system. I wanted to leave you with something to sort of get started on this if you have an interest. And really all you need is a blank sheet. I call it a value stream canvas. And it's a way where you can first put up the work items where work initiates. Where does your demand originate from? Is it a phone call? Is it in a work system? How does that enter into your area where you do work? And for production, whatever that is, if it's an ITSM system, then put it up there. And then identify what the work item types are, how that work comes in. And then do that on the other end, too, for your revenue generation types of work that stem from the business, the new feature requests or the ideas. Put that up on this canvas. And from there, start connecting the dots. Right? Try and find a way to synchronize how this communication is happening. And if it's manual with emails, then be sure to put those emails or spreadsheets or whatever up on your chart. Find a way to see the bottlenecks. It's like make work visible, but now we're going deeper. Make connections visible. So the benefits are transformative. We've seen this. You get speed. You get, where's my thing? You can see the progress of the work, right? You don't have as much duplicate entry that teams are grumbling about. You don't have to dig through email to find the important information because work is flowing through your different work systems. And making these connections visible is what helps teams become mutually aware of critical information sooner. So in my career, I've had every chance to be an interface between two different teams. The problem is so important that we have to communicate this manually if there's no other way. And this is what attracted me so much to Tasktop, because they're fixing the communication debt problem, right, from all these fragmented handoffs. They're making connections visible. Just like Cirque du Soleil trapeze artists have synchronized handoffs, so should your value stream. And with that, we're done. If you would like a copy of this presentation, just send an email to Dominica@sendyourslides.com. Make sure you put flow in the subject, and you'll get an automatic email reply with a copy of my presentation, and also some other goodies in here. If you want to learn more about Tasktop, there's a video on integration between ServiceNow and Jira. And there's also a link to get some help to fill out what Tasktop calls value stream architecture. If you want to talk more about this, I'm going to host a Lean Coffee this afternoon. Same place, same time as yesterday, 3:15 up in the foyer out here of the theater. So just come find me, and we'll talk more about making connections visible. Thank you so much.